Today is October the 11th, 1997. We're on campus of Abilene Christian University. We're interviewing Louise Middleton Crawford today, and the interviewer is Vernon L. Williams with the Department of History. Louise, if you would, tell us a little bit about where you were born and how you grew up, who your parents were. Just tell us a little bit about your family background in those early days just after your birth.
I was born in Nugent, Texas, in a farm community, and my parents were Mr. and Mrs. John Middleton. They were farmers, and it was a small community. I went to the small school at Nugent for the first 9 years. The last 2 years, I went to Luters High School, and I had 2 brothers and 2 sisters. We worked in the fields when we were growing up. We had a church in the community where we grew up, and we attended the Nugent Church of Christ, and we had a nice-sized congregation. Nugent at that time, of course, was a nice-sized community, and I enjoyed the friends that I had in that community, and I was fortunate enough that there were several girls my age, and we all had a good time together.
Could you tell me, just for the record, the name of your father, the name of your mother, and the names of your brothers and sisters?
My father was John Middleton. My mother was Lena Moorhead before she married. My oldest brother is Charles Alton Middleton. My oldest sister is Aileen Middleton, and J.T. Middleton and Zonabelle Middleton, who passed away in 1961.
When you look back at your home, if there was some way you can go back in a time machine and to the front yard, and you got out and walked to the front door and walked in, what would you see? Could you describe what your home was like there at Nugent?
We lived in a small house. We had a living room and a bed, 2 bedrooms, and then we had a room on the back porch. We had a screened-in back porch, and there was a dining area and a kitchen, small kitchen.
Well, as your kids grew up, how did you handle the bedroom situation with such small numbers of rooms?
Well, when we had children, not all of us were home at that time. Some of us were. Well, I was the first one to marry. My sister was living in Dallas and married a few months after I did, and my brother one of my brothers was in the service during World War II, and then my younger brother went to the Navy just after World War II.
What was the date of your birth, by the way?
January the 29th, 1926.
When you think back to your school days, is there any teacher or class or course, year, anything that stands out, made an impression on you as a young girl, just let's say in elementary and junior high school?
We had just elementary and high school at that time. I had a teacher in elementary school, Hazel Harvey, that, well, all of them made an impression, but she definitely made an impression on me. And also Nig Womack was a teacher that made an impression on me. And we had sports at Nugent, and I always enjoyed playing basketball and volleyball when I was in Nugent, and also I played basketball at Luters when I went to Luters.
When you finish high school, what do you do, and when would this be? When did you graduate?
I graduated in May of 1943. I came to Abilene and went to work for Southwestern Bell Telephone Company.
Before we talk about that, let's back up. Since you graduated in '43, the war was on. What impact did Pearl Harbor have on the high school when you were there as, I guess, a sophomore, junior, senior?
Junior. We were all sad, of course, and shocked at what at the Japanese bombing Pearl Harbor, and everyone, of course, began to wonder what the future would be for us. And there were young men in my one young man in my graduating class went to the Army before we had our graduating exercises. And most of them did go into the service after graduation.
But it didn't have an immediate effect where you lost any other than the one as a junior or senior going in with parental consent or anything like that?
No, sir.
Do you remember where you were when you heard the news about Pearl Harbor?
Yes, we had just gotten home from church when we heard the news on Sunday morning.
What was the family's reaction to that at that particular moment, that time?
Well, you know, it came as a shock, and of course, with my brother being let's see, I was a sophomore, he was a junior, and at that age, of course, the first thing they wondered about was would he have to go into the service, or would we go into war? Of course, you know, war was not declared until the next day. I went to school the next day, and I was in the study hall, and the teacher brought a radio so we could all listen to the president that day when he declared that we were in war.
Do you remember what the reaction was in the study hall after the president's speech? Do you remember anything about that?
It seems we all just got very quiet. And the teachers, as well as I remember, they didn't comment too much. I don't remember too much about the reaction, really. But it's the only thing I can remember is that things did get quiet.
Now, at Nugent, you went through most of your years there before you went to Luther's. Were there any changes over that time? Can you remember in, like, the number of buildings, the size of the schoolhouse, that kind of thing? Was it basically the same when you left for Luther's as it was when you started?
Yes. They never did add to the building at Nugent. It was a brick building with a flat roof, and there was 4 rooms and a hallway, and we had an auditorium upstairs.
Is that building still standing?
No, sir. It has been. The roof fell in, and then I think the walls began to tumble, and I guess they just tore it down.
Well, tell me a little bit about what you did as soon as you graduated from high school.
I did not want to stay on the farm. I wanted to go to work. So first my sister and I went to Stanford, Texas, to look for a job, and there were not very many available jobs there. And then we moved back home, and we went to Abilene. And that's when I went to work for Southwestern Bell Telephone Company.
How did you get that job?
I went to the office and put in my application. I had a friend that was from Luther's, and she got a job there. So I went up and went to the office and put in my application, and they did hire me. And I enjoyed working at the telephone office, and we were very, very busy because Camp Barkley was there. And there were hundreds and hundreds of men at Camp Barkley. And on Sunday afternoon, I worked from 2:30 until 6. I worked at the switchboard where the men from the northeastern states lived, New York, in that area, and it was very, very busy, and I did feel sorry for them because they would have to wait 4 and 5 hours to get their call through, and then we would have them to limit their call to 5 minutes because we had so many waiting to call home.
Can you tell me a little bit about Abilene as you come in and begin your career with Southwestern Bell? Where did you go to church? Where did you live? And what kind of housing conditions did you have? That kind of thing.
My sister and I lived with 2 other sisters, and we lived on Butternut Street, and we had a large room that was on the second. This was a large house, and we lived on the second floor. And we walked to work, and it was not too far from where I worked. And I didn't mind the walk. When I first went to work at the telephone office, I had to work until 10 or 10:30 in the evening. And sometimes I would work a split shift. I'd go to work like 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock in the morning and work until 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and then go back at 6 o'clock and work until 10. Everything was downtown, the downtown area. My sister worked for W.T. Grant, and the businesses were downtown. It was a big business area. It's not like it is today.
Well, you had, of course, when you came to Abilene in 1943, I imagine you had to compete with a lot of servicemen's families for housing. From what they tell me, it was very difficult to get a room. Was it difficult for the 4 of you to get this room?
No, sir, we were very fortunate. My mother knew, had a friend that had a sister that had this large house, and she was renting out rooms. And my mother talked with this friend, and she gave us the name and the address. And we went to see her, and she rented us a room. So we were very fortunate.
What was it like walking home that late at night?
Well, on weekends, when the soldiers were on leave and were in town, there was a lot of people on the street, but during the week there was not very many people, and I was fortunate enough to have girls, 1 or 2 girls that worked at the telephone office that was coming, that walked with me, and I only had to walk 1 block by myself, but it was nerve-wracking.
Do you remember about where the telephone office was that you worked at?
It was in the downtown area, on next to the Paramount Theater on Cypress.
So it was actually on that block?
Isn't that? I believe that's
Yes,
right. It was
on
on, and yes, it was. There was a little food stand between Paramount Theater and the telephone office.
Which way would the telephone office be? Back towards the train station?
It was north of the Paramount Theater.
Could you tell me what it was like to have to battle the lines when you're trying to place these calls, or did you just originate the call and some other operator in some other part would handle it and call you back? How did that work? In other words, when you placed the call?
Well, sometimes we had, we would have a direct. Sometimes we'd have to go through another station to get a call, and then sometimes they would be direct. And it was, sometimes it was hard for us to understand the people in the North, and it was hard for them to understand. In some word, we would have to, if we said 9, we said 9 to them. And there was another number, I forget it now, that we had to pronounce it in a different way. But it was different to talk with them, because they did talk just a little different than we did. And at the same time, I think it was interesting for us to be able to talk with them. since they were from a different part of the country, as well as talking to the men from that section of the country. You know, most of them did not like Abilene because we didn't have bars. We were not a wet town for drinks, and they did not like Texas.
Well, I'd have to tell you that after half a century, they're still grousing about that.
I know.
They've never gotten over it. What'd you do for recreation?
We went to movies a lot of time. When we had the split shift, like if I worked until 2 o'clock and would go back to work at 6, we would go to a movie, and then we would go eat out and come back to the office. We had a lounge, and we would wait there until time to go back to work. And sometimes we would go shopping. And sometimes I would go back home and write letters or have something else to do, and then I would come back in time for me to go to work.
Did you ever have any contact with the soldiers?
I married. That's where I met. My husband was stationed at Camp Barkley, and we married after he came back from the war.
How did you meet him?
My sister was working at Grant, and she had a date with one of the soldiers, and Harry came with him. And my sister, I usually called her when I was on my break, and so she told me, she said, I have a date tonight, and he brought in a friend with him, and I told him that you got off at 10 o'clock and we would meet you. And I said, you know I don't like blind dates. What'd you do that for?
That line has been repeated countless times in American history.
I know. But
what was your first impression of him?
Well, I thought he was nice looking, and he was very nice, but he didn't like Texas, of course, and I thought he was a little conceited. But the next time, the next Saturday night, we had a date, and I liked him a little better. I thought he had calmed down a little bit. He wasn't quite as conceited, and we, had a better conversation, talked more, and it went from there. And then I realized that I really did like him on the third and fourth date. And needless to say, we married after the war.
Where was he from?
He was from Nebraska.
So he wasn't like a real Yankee or anything that drastic?
Not that drastic. He did not like Texas. Of course, not any of them, I guess, like Texas when they first get here, because after all, they were in the service, and it was a different way of life, and he did his training here, and of course for about 6 weeks they could not go anywhere, and the training, and the wind blew, and there was a lot of dust, and he lived in one of the barracks, and so the living conditions were not was not like at home.
Do you remember what unit he was in, what division?
No, I'm sorry, I don't.
Did you ever go out to Barkley for, like, the movies or anything out there?
No, I didn't.
So you had all your dates in town?
In town.
Can you tell us a little bit about how that was? What kind of things you did?
We would go out to eat and go to the movies. And, of course, I didn't get off until 9 or 10 o'clock. And we usually went to a late movie. And, of course, we walked everywhere we went. And because I didn't live far, and, of course, trying to catch a bus or something like it was easier just to walk. And, of course, we could visit more and as we walked. And time went very fast. But there wasn't really much you could do other than going to movies and eating out.
What about eating out? Do you remember any of the places that you used to frequent? Like the Dixie Pig, did you ever go there?
No, we didn't go to the Dixie Pig. I'm trying to think of the name of a restaurant that I like so well, and right now I can't think of the name of the restaurant, but I know that the thing I can remember about it is that I enjoyed their enchiladas. So they had the best enchiladas, and you could get 2 for 30 cents at that time. But we didn't eat at the same restaurant all the time. But that was one of my favorite restaurants. But was there a Mac Eaplin's? Yes, that's what it was, Mac Eaplin's.
Was it difficult to get a table at a restaurant with all the competition from all the people who had moved in and that kind of thing?
When we would have our evening, our supper breaks in the evening, we had 1 hour, and on the weekends, sometimes it was very hard. In fact, sometimes we would have to go back to the office and stop at the little stand that was close to the telephone office and pick up a snack and go back to the office and eat, because we didn't have time to get a table and get waited on and eat at the restaurant. Now, during the week it was not bad, but on the weekend sometimes it was very bad. And the same way with going to the movies, we'd have to stand in line for some time on the weekend.
When you came to Abilene and spent time working here, were you active in one of the congregations here?
I went to Highland on Sunday morning. I arranged my schedule at the telephone office to work 2:30 to 10:30. So that I would could go to church on Sunday morning.
What about your future husband? How did he fit in with church? Did he have a church cross background?
No.
Was that a problem?
He was brought up in a Methodist church, and he didn't go to church with me until after we were married. And he had never been to the Church of Christ. And at first he of course, didn't, he was a little upset at what he heard. But he continued to go to church with me. And I told him that I would go with him if he wanted to go, but not to ask me to go on Sunday morning. And he never did ask me to go to the Methodist church with him. He just continued going with me. And when we were transferred to Odessa in 1950, and in 1952 he was converted and was a very strong Christian.
Well, do you remember anything about when you found out he was going to be leaving and being transferred overseas?
He was sent from Berkeley, he was sent to El Paso. And when he left Berkeley, he could not even call me or anything and let me know he was being transferred. And I got a letter from him from El Paso, and he was there for a short time, and then he was sent to San Francisco. And of course, he could not tell me when he was going to be shipped out. And then I got a letter from him, and of course, I got some letters from him overseas that had parts of his letters cut out. They were very strict on what they could write to us.
What do you remember about the last time you saw him? In other words, the last meeting you had before you went to El Paso?
Well, I didn't realize that would be the last time I would see him before he went overseas, because they didn't know when they were going to be shipped out, and I guess they told them one day and shipped out the next, or maybe they shipped out the same day. I don't know. I have forgotten what he said about that. But the first Saturday night that he wasn't there, I was afraid that's what had happened, and it gave me a very sad feeling, and I wondered if he would get to come back.
Now, he's gone off for further training and going into war. You're not sure just where he is and what he's doing. Do you stay in Abilene for the rest of the war working for Southwestern?
Yes, sir.
Tell me a little bit about your roommates or your friends. Did you develop any friendships that were lifelong that you kept up with? Or was this just a war interlude?
Of course, one of them was my sister. The other roommates, they grew up in a farm community not far from our farm community, and we already knew them. And we stayed in contact for a long time. One of them has already passed away. But we have lost contact in the last few years with them.
What their names? I'm not sure if we...
Gladys Buskey and Darlene Buskey.
How would you spell that last name? Do you know?
Buske, I believe, but I'm not. I have forgotten really.
What community were they from?
They were from. Well, it was a community north of I think it was north of Anson, but I have forgotten now what the name of the community. It's been a long time, and I hadn't even thought about that. But it was a small farm community like the Nugent community.
During the rest of the war now, what did you do for recreation? Did you date anymore, or had you decided that this Harry was the one for you?
I had a friend from the community that I grew up in, and occasionally we went on a date, but not very often. And no, I had decided he was the one that I wanted, and I didn't go with any more GIs. And I continued to work, and our friends, and I would go home. I had 2 days a week off, and I went home, and of course had contact with my friends there. And but I went home. I enjoyed going back home on my days off. Occasionally I stayed in town, but most of the time I went back home.
What do you remember about Abilene? Any memories of living here and life here that you haven't already talked about that you'd like to add to your description?
I don't think so. Offhand, I cannot remember too much. Of course, now after Harry and I married, we lived in Abilene. And I do know that Abilene has grown a lot since the war. It was a smaller town at that time. In fact, I think there was almost as many GIs at Camp Barkley as there were people that lived in the town of Abilene.
What about corresponding back and forth? Did you keep any of the letters that you received from him, and did he keep any of the letters that you wrote him?
I don't think he could keep many of the letters that I wrote him because they were moving all the time. He was sent to the Philippines, and there was a lot of fighting that went on in the Philippines, and they couldn't keep all of their mail, and I kept his letters for years. And then we had a tornado in Wichita Falls in '79, the big tornado they had, and we were in that tornado. And after that, after we got our house repaired and moved back in, foolishly, I threw his letters away. He couldn't understand why I was keeping them, and I wish now I had continued keeping them, because he passed away in February of 1988 at 63.
Well, he's at war. Does he know that you made the decision that he's the one?
Yes.
What could you tell me a little bit about Abilene when you hear news that the war is over in Germany, and then, of course, more importantly for you, the Japanese surrender? What's going on in Abilene at that time?
I was sitting at the switchboard at the time the war ended, and the switchboard lit up like a Christmas tree. And all at once we hear all of this noise out in the streets, and it wasn't long until I was relieved from my break, and I went to the window and looked out the window, and there was bumper-to-bumper traffic, and people were blowing the horn, and people were shouting, and was very joyful because the war was over. And then I went on down to the little food stand, to get something to eat, and there were GIs standing next to the wall with tears in their eyes, and we were crying. and it was a very joyful time, and it's something you don't forget. You can still see those GIs standing there with their tears in their eyes, and this feeling that you had. And the last time I heard from Harry, he was all right, and I knew, and of course I kept hoping and praying that he was still all right. And you thought, it seemed almost like a dream, but because the war had gone on for so many years, for about 4 years. And it was a joyful time, and everyone was just being very joyful about it. But Harry told me after he got home that if Japanese had not surrendered the day that they surrendered, that they would have been, that there was Japanese across the river from them, and they would have probably killed all of them. There were so many more Japanese than the American soldiers, and he said that we probably would have all been killed the next day. So I think the Lord was with him all the time he was over there.
Tell us a little bit about your reunion with Harry.
I was still working at the telephone office, and at that time, my sister had moved to Dallas, and the other two ladies, one of them, her husband had come back, and the other lady had, I think she had quit and gone back home, quit working and gone back home. So I lived with a friend that was working at the telephone office, lived with her mother and her sister. And that morning, we had gotten up and had to eat breakfast, and somebody knocked on the door. And I looked out the window, and it was Harry, and I ran and opened the door. And of course, we just grabbed each other and kissed each other. And there I was with my house coat on. That was not how I had planned to greet him when he came back. But I didn't have time to, in fact, when I saw it was him, I didn't even think about the fact that I just had I still had on my robe. I was just so happy to see him. And we had a real nice day that day.
What happens to him? Is he still in the Army, or is he discharged soon after that?
He was discharged before he came to see me. He came into the San Francisco, and then he went from there to Wyoming. I think that I can't remember. It was a bus or a plane or how what transportation he used. He was trying to get home to Nebraska, and he was in Wyoming, and then he went from there to Nebraska, and he got home and came down with malaria, and he had to get over that before he could come to see me. Of course, I had already heard from him, but he had to get over the malaria before he came to see me. He was home about a week or 10 days before he came to see me.
Was he bothered with malaria anymore the rest of the
Yes,
time?
sir. He had several bad attacks, but then he got over it and wasn't bothered with it, but he took quinine, I believe it was, for a long time, and that's what helped him to get over it. Overseas, he had malaria and yellow jaundice both.
What did you do about marriage plans?
He came one day and we married the next.
No grass growing under your feet. So what did you get married at, Highland?
No, sir. We married in the preacher's home. In a preacher's home. And we decided we had waited for 2 years, and so we didn't wait any longer.
Describe the wedding. In other words, the setting. Who was there?
I had a friend. The girlfriend that I was living with, she was my maid of honor, and her boyfriend was the best man, and the preacher and his wife were there, and there was no family. We should have waited and married at my mother and dad's home on Sunday, but we didn't. We we just wanted to get married. And of course we have no regrets, but we should have waited until Sunday, I guess, and married in my mother and dad's home, but we didn't.
So what's your initial plans? When you sit down and you talk about what you're going to do, what decides that you're going to stay in Abilene?
Well, first we went to Denver. He had came through Denver to see his dad, and so his dad knew where he could get a job. So he decided we would go to Denver, and we went to Denver. But we only stayed about 5 months, and we decided that we wanted to be closer to family, and he said since he was used to being away from home, that we would. And he thought that he'd be able to get a job quicker in Abilene than he could any large town close to where his mother lived. So we decided to come back to Abilene and live in and him find a job in Abilene, and we lived there until he went to work for White's. It was White's Auto Store at that time in September of that year. He worked at a service station until he got a job with White's Auto Store, and he worked for White's Auto Store almost 40 years.
Do you remember where you lived in Abilene during that?
Let's see, we lived on South 11th in a garage apartment.
What it was close to, what other street, the intersection it was close to?
No, sir, I'm sorry, I don't remember.
Have you been back to see if it's still standing?
Not in the last few years. I haven't.
What was different now after the war is over? Are you working? What's happening in terms of your life? What things you did, and of course the marriage and children. Give us an idea of what the next 5 years or so was like.
Well, our first son, Ron, was born in 10 months after we were married, and we in 1950, he was born in 1946, November 1946. We were married in January of 1946. I forgot to mention that. And in 1950, we were transferred to Odessa, Texas, with White's. Harry was transferred as assistant, and he was assistant manager at Odessa. And then in 1952, Dale was born. In February of 1952, Dale was born. And we lived in Odessa until 1958, and we were transferred to San Antonio for a few months, and then we were transferred back to Odessa. And then let's see, now I'm mixed up here. We moved back to Abilene. We were moved back to Abilene. And we lived in Abilene until 62, and then we were transferred to Tampa, Florida, and lived there for 4 years, and we were transferred to Macon, Georgia, and lived there for 6 years. And then we were transferred to Wichita Falls, Texas, and that was 24 years ago. And I'm still in Wichita Falls.
So we're thinking, most of us here on campus, that once Dale was born, it was kind of rowdy and had lots of problems.
Yes,
after that.
yes.
We were quick to pick up on that. We didn't have to talk to his mother to do that.
I want to say I am very proud of both of my boys. They have done well. They both attended Abilene Christian.
Well, have you got anything else you'd like to add about the war years, about growing up, any of the eras that we've talked about that you might like to add to the interview?
During the war, there were some things that were rationed. Tires were rationed, sugar was rationed, gasoline was rationed, and we could not get nylon hose, And a lot of times in the winter we went without hose because hose were not available. And in the wintertime it was very cold. uh, and there were some, it's so different from today. I'm sure the young people, and I think there were some other things that was rationed offhand. I can't think what they are, but there were a few things that were rationed. And with the gasoline being rationed, it made it very hard in traveling. You had to be very careful where you went. And we were living on the farm. Of course, my mother and dad raised big gardens, so we didn't, as far as food, we didn't pay any attention to the rationing of the foods. I don't think that there was anything rationed. Coffee, I think, might have been rationed. But a lot of women went to work during World War II because the men, most of the men in the neighborhood was in the all of the towns and farm communities were gone to war, and that's when so many women went to work. A lot of them went to work in the defense plants. My sister had a very close friend that went to work at Fort Worth. I think it was Fort Worth in a defense plant. But that's when so many women went to work.
How did you deal with the problem of transportation when you went home on weekends?
We had a mail carrier that delivered the mail to Nugent, and we could ride with him and ride back with him. And sometimes my dad would come and pick us up. But with the gasoline rations, he couldn't do that all the time.
Well, I think that will be all, unless you can think of anything else you'd like to add.
Well, I don't think I can, right now, I can't think of anything.
Well, thank you very much. This is the end of tape.